And just a very warm welcome, a very brief introduction on my part, just to, on behalf of the college, to welcome each and every one of you in these strange times that we're beginning to live in Ireland and for the world indeed. So look, you're very welcome this evening to this public lecture in honour of a well-remembered and fondly remembered still President and Professor of Ecclesiastical History and then later Modern History. Just maybe it's my privilege just to say a few words about Monsignor Patrick Corish and this annual lecture which is dedicated to him, and to recall the man that we're honouring this evening. Patrick Corish, for some of you will remember this very well, but for those of you who don't know him, was born in 1921, and he began his studies in the college in 1939, and he spent almost 7 decades of his life dedicated his life to this college, both as a priest and as an academic. Also as president and professor of, as I said, Ecclesiastical History initially. He was appointed in 1947, and then much later in 1975, he was appointed professor of modern history in Maynooth University. And I actually remember attending his Friday lectures, studying on the history of Ireland and the Church in Ireland. Like his works, as some of you know well, included especially Maynooth College, which is still a standard reference for us. It's a great book. It's a big tome. We were doing a very big project there recently in the college, and his tome was one of the key textbooks that people were reading. Now, they were reading it from a very particular angle on property, but they thought it was a great history of the property of the college. Obviously, it's full of great anecdotes as well about the college historical. But and then he held also the masterly work was the Irish Catholic Experience, which was published in 1985. He was the editor of Archivium Hibernicum, and his work he worked as a coordinator of the History of Irish Catholicism project. They were all fundamental. He was also very involved in progressing the causes of many of the Irish martyrs and over the years. He was renowned for his dry sense of wit, sometimes dark, but a mischievous humour, a sense of innocent mischief, and his anecdotes are still recalled here at the dining room table regularly. He was very highly regarded, and in the lecture hall he was entertaining and always engaging. So this annual lecture is a fitting tribute to Monsignor Patrick Corish, historian and scholar, and I am delighted to welcome you, Professor Morgan from Duke University, who you follow in the steps of many distinguished scholars and historians to deliver this annual tribute to Monsignor Corish. So I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and I hope it's an engaging and interesting lecture that's coming up this evening. So I now invite Professor Salvador Ryan to introduce our guest speaker tonight. So thank you very much.
Tramona Mahagri. Before an frivleid gom falchi chialig occur riv Ontology David Morgan, quid Colosh Forig Maynooth, agus a quid Scolarocht occur in Ahmad. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor David Morgan here this evening and to say something about his background and his scholarship. Originally from rural Iowa, David Morgan gained his BA in Studio Art from Concordia College, Nebraska, before going on to complete an MA in Art History at the University of Arizona. He subsequently studied the history of European and American Christian thought with Bernard McGinn and Martin Marty when he was a doctoral student at the University of Chicago, concentrating on art history because he'd originally planned on a dissertation examining the history of art and religion in Europe and America. But his dissertation took a turn towards the history of art theory, and he completed his Ph.D. on concepts of abstraction in German art theory 1750 to 1914 under Professor Reinhold Heller in 1990. And in that same year, he took up a position as assistant professor in the Department of Art at Valparaiso University until his appointment as professor of religious studies at Duke University, with a secondary appointment in the Department of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies in 2008. But it was at Valparaiso that his scholarly journey was to take a turn. In the fall of his first year as an assistant professor in 1990, he was invited to a small conference on art and religion at Anderson University in Indiana. There he was shown the recently acquired collection of images by the Protestant artist Warner Salmon, in particular his well-known Head of Christ. And Professor Morgan recalls, he says, "I was so astonished that there was actually an original painting behind all the lithographed copies of this image that I began on the spot to think about how one might study this image. That was the beginning of my interest in popular religious imagery." And it was something of a moment of revelation because, as Professor Morgan recalls, he says, "Suddenly, looking at this ubiquitous Head of Christ, I rewired my neural network and began thinking about a new way to do religious history. I'd been trained as a historian of art with an emphasis on art theory, and it's fair to say that occupies the opposite end of the intellectual universe from popular devotional visual culture. I began to think about issues involving production, distribution, and reception. My focus shifted to mass culture, from fine art to visual culture, archives, and inexpensive stuff. The biggest difference was an abrupt change from studying highbrow aesthetic objects to the worlds evoked by mass-produced lithographs, tracts, and Bible illustrations. This led Professor Morgan, like a number of other scholars, to now pay much more attention to everyday things, to music, to clothing, to images, to not be stuck on fine art or geniuses, or as he says, on blue-chip theologians or grand narratives. Historians nowadays are much more comfortable with messiness, with instability, with impermanence and multiplicity. Professor Morgan is author or editor of 13 books and also founding editor of the journal Material Religion, an international peer-reviewed journal which seeks to explore how religion happens in material culture, images, devotional and liturgical objects, architecture and sacred space, works of arts and mass-produced artifacts. But the focus is not only the material forms, but the many different practices in which they are put to work: ritual, ceremony, instruction, pilgrimage, display, liturgy, and interpretation. These constitute many of the practices whereby religious material culture constructs the worlds of belief. Why does an image seem powerful to a person or a group of people? Now, the American scholar Robert Orsi, a friend and colleague of David Morgan, has written that religion is not primarily about meaning, but about relationships, materialization, and making the invisible visible. And this strikes a particular chord with me, if you'll permit me to be personal, because I've had experience of it in my own lifetime, and the following story, which I've already told to David, so please excuse the repetition, but it concerns my late father and his bundle of prayers, which he'd spread out on the kitchen table and recite every afternoon. Now, there was one particular prayer card that he was especially devoted to. It was of the Virgin Mary, and it had come from the United States, so it was quite glossy, and Mary was at her most glamorous. For all the world, she was a dead ringer for Linda Carter, the original Wonder Woman of the 1970s TV series. And I always remember with that particular prayer card, I always remember my father gazing at the picture of the Blessed Virgin and then turning it over to recite the Memorare prayer. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection. And then he'd stop and he'd turn it round again. He'd have another look at the image. And I'll always remember him. He did this a number of times through, he hardly ever got through the Memorare prayer. He was turning it back and forth so often. And I always remember him looking up from the image to me and commenting quite seriously, Jesus, she was a lovely looking woman all the same, wasn't she? Professor Morgan is co-editor of a book series at Bloomsbury entitled Bloomsbury Studies in Material Religion. His latest book is Images at Work, The Material Culture of Enchantment, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Other books include The Forge of Vision, A Visual History of Modern Christianity, The Sacred Heart of Jesus, The Visual Evolution of a Devotion, The Love of Images, A History of Religion and Visual Media in America, and so on. There are a number of titles. He is an elected life member at Clare Hall, Cambridge University, an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society. And he's currently working on a book project entitled The Thing About Religion, An Introduction to Studying the Materiality of Belief, which is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. What the work of Professor David Morgan reminds us once again is that matter matters, and that sometimes the most fruitful of scholarly quests can begin right there, under our noses, under our very noses, in the objects and the practices that are just waiting to be afforded our undivided attention. David, it's a great pleasure to welcome you on your first visit to Ireland, and thereby your first visit to Maynooth, to deliver the annual Monsignor Patrick J. Corish lecture on the subject of the visual culture of revelation, visions and the imagery that make them visible. Professor David Morgan.
Thank you very much, Salvador, for your introduction. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank you publicly for the invitation to give this year's Corish lecture, and for your gracious hosting while I've been here. It's been a pleasure to get to know St. Patrick's and to meet a number of members of the community. So, the topic of my remarks this evening arises from a problem. I'd like eventually to solve this problem, and tonight's lecture is maybe a down payment on that. But I welcome your, afterwards, the conversation in suggestions you might make of whatever kind. The study of religious visual culture over the past few decades has done much to help us understand the role that images play in religious practices. But we have learned less, I think, particularly in the modern study of religions, the last couple of centuries, about the relationship of images and visual practices to other visual phenomena that are of central importance to religions everywhere, Christianity and far beyond. I'm talking about, in particular, dreams and visions. I think medievalists have given this much more attention than modernist historians, and it's time, I think, for modernists to ramp up and attend to this, particularly in the study of Catholicism, modern Catholicism, in which Marian apparitions, for instance, are so important. My remarks today will focus on a case of visionary experience and devotion in exploring how pictorial imagery helps make something as ineffable and evanescent as visionary experience accessible to the faithful as revelation. What do images contribute to the process? I'm going to argue that visual interpretation is fundamental to what is best described as a process, revelation as process, rather than simply as an event, a single event. To that end, I will consider the visual culture of Our Lady of Fatima. This statue is one of the earliest devotional images of the subject. I'm talking about the one on the left. A wood carving of 1920 by a Portuguese sculptor named José Tejim, who was commissioned by a local businessman to produce an image of what 3 young children reported seeing during 6 consecutive months, from May to October of 1917, near the village of Fatima in Portugal. Examining what this image means and how it works, as well as a stream of related images, such as the one beside it, which was, actually these are both the early one. I'm showing you just a couple different angles of it. I can summarize this stream of images in the following way. Pictorial imagery helps make revelation accessible by performing two critical functions. First, by suggesting patterns of recognition that enabled the children to discern a perceptible figure in the light and clouds from which Our Lady emerged. Well, they didn't call her Our Lady at first, they called her the Lady, which in turn was articulated by image makers in order, second, to stabilize, to suggest and to stabilize the object of devotion for the sake of devotional use. Suggestion and stabilization are the two broad forms to be considered here. In what follows, I will move from one to the other and back again in developing my argument, since the two always collaborated as the children interacted with those who pressed them for more information about what they saw, including the official church, which was concerned to determine the authenticity and theological propriety of the apparitions and what Mary was understood to deliver as a message. The story of Fatima begins with the reports of three Portuguese children in 1917, seen here in a prayer card from the 1950s. The card shows an official statue of Our Lady produced in 1946, appearing to the three children, hovering above the massive shrine that was eventually built on the site of the apparition. The shrine and the sculpture were not there in 1917, but they are now inseparable from the devotion. This is what they look like today. This contrasts markedly with what the place originally looked like, a barren stretch of grass and scrub oak where the children took their sheep to graze. The prayer card I showed you wants to suggest a sculpturesque figure appeared before them. If that were so, it seems very doubtful that the children would have failed to recognize the figure as Our Lady. But in fact, they did not know who she was, and she did not actually reveal her identity until the end of the 6 months of apparitions. In a 1922 account written by Lucia, one of the children, at the request of, she went on to become a nun, at the request of her spiritual director, the apparitional figure only told Lucia that she was, quote, the Lady of the Rosary on October 13th, the last of the 6 apparitions. In an interview 2 years later, Lucia said, quote, before she said she was the Lady of the Rosary, I did not know who she was. Now I am convinced she was Our Lady, unquote. So what did the children actually see? In 1941, Lucia corrected her childhood memory of seeing earrings on the figure, which the other 2 children had contradicted in interviews with the same priest on September 29, 1917. They were interviewed throughout the period of apparition, sometimes on the same day that they saw the figure. Lucia said later in 1941, quote, I did not see earrings. I remember the golden cord that like a radiant sunbeam seemed to edge her mantle, reflected in the empty space left falling from the head to the shoulders against the radiance of Our Lady in such a way that made varied light frizzes, is her term, which sometimes gave me the idea of small earrings. I must have referred to this when I gave that answer in 1917, unquote. Her statement is fascinating because it posits that already in the midst of the apparitions, she was not simply seeing them, but was engaged in interpretation of what appeared as dazzling light and color. There is a clear difference between raw optical or neurological experience and recognition. In other words, what she experienced as a vision and what she thought she saw were not identical. My point here is not to debunk the vision, but to establish that even on the evidence of the visionary's own account, there was a significant distinction between the sensation of a vision and what the vision was taken to represent. Yet, as I will argue, both moments are necessary for revelation to happen. This difference is where images come in as interpretive devices. If we allow this still from a pious film about Fatima made in 1952, if we allow it, for the sake of conversation, to stand for what the children saw and to assume that they saw something, these sculptures and pictorial images stabilize the original, ephemeral, and ineffable visual sensation and memory of Our Lady for the purpose of a devotional cultus. The power of images, I want to suggest, is their capacity to resolve ambivalence or incompleteness by merging fragments of sensation into some manner of wholes. Images perform as hybrids of what people see, what they remember having seen, what they want to see, what they imagine they saw, and draw from the history of what other people saw and what artists produce as what other people saw. In other words, images do all of these, which means that an image is an amalgam of mental imagery, pictures, photographs, paintings, memories, fantasies, dreams, hallucinations, misperceptions, and ideological dispositions. An image is never just a visual trace, but something that draws from a variety of media and events. An image may be best described as an entanglement. One YouTube celebration of Fatima shows this very literally by freely intermingling photographs, digital illustration, a sculpture, lore, and pious sentiment to portray the miraculous appearance of Mary. I'm showing you a photograph of the children from 1917, which was appropriated by this image maker. Through the remediation, though in fact the remediation of this photograph in the image on the left betrays the seams of its manufacture in the imperfect use of Photoshop software. Note how the children on the left, in the left image, float above the ground. Haven't quite mastered the use of Photoshop to anchor them. Careful parsing of an image will show that entanglement in various patterns of appropriation, remediation, redaction, quotation, elision, and synthesis brings them together into an image like that on the left, which still shows the marks of its manufacture. All of these are the means of shaping images in an evolving process of fitting devotion and imagery to the content of the vision as it evolves and to the precedents and constraints of officially sanctioned belief. So there's a series of interactions here that gradually shape images and attempt to stabilize what it is that is thought to matter. A familiar feature in pious accounts of saints' lives and Marian apparitions is the redaction of events and reports into narratives that are purged of ambivalence, contradiction, inconsistency, and irresolution. Perhaps not completely purged, but that is one goal. There are often those who carefully preserve the variora, particularly in official church investigations. But for devotions to take root, proponents enthusiastically seek and produce a standard account and a corresponding iconography. In 1920, 3 years after the apparitions, a statue of Our Lady carved by Tejim was installed at a small chapel built on site at Fatima. You see the figure here, as well as a small chapel built there on the very site of the apparitions. It was begun in 1918 and completed in 1919. The sculpture, that is the chapel, the sculpture produced in 1920 and placed there immediately quickly acquired iconic status as the focus of devotion and the destination of pilgrimage that boasted the authenticity of being based on what the children described having seen. It also, the sculpture, also quickly achieved what I would call paradigmatic status by serving as the model for endless reiterations and reproductions. As icon and paradigm, Tejim's image became the basis for an expanding devotion. The figure appears on the cover of a small tract promoting the use of the rosary in family, published in 1937. And it is posed in a tree as the children reported seeing it. Not the sculpture, but Our Lady. By placing the sculpture in the tree, hovering on a small cloud, this image presumes that the figure, the sculpted figure by Tejim, portrays just what the three children beheld, such that what they saw, devotees now see in Tejim's image. That may seem obvious, but if you think about it, it's a significant move because it then correlates what is in front of one with what is reported and seeks to cancel any sort of uncomfortable distinction. Affirmation of the figure was immediate, according to one account of the original unveiling of the statue in 1920, to the faithful on the 3rd anniversary of the first apparition. When the figure was removed from its crate at Fatima, the people on hand, as one priest recalled, quote, rushed forward to kiss the statue, which seemed so perfectly to reproduce the serious and beautiful vision described by the children. A girl of 13 leaned over it with tears running down her cheeks. It was Lucia, the girl who had actually did most of the talking and describing what the apparition was about. The historical record is more complicated than that, in fact, as we shall see. Lucia herself would later take exception to this statue and call for the creation of what she hoped would be a more accurate version. Nevertheless, devotees of Fatima embraced Tejim's image from the beginning as an authentic portrayal. But how did the children arrive at a firm sense of what they saw in order that his image could become the icon and paradigm of the vision? In a series of interviews with the three children, Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco, which was published in November of 1917, so just 1 month after the series of apparitions ended, Father José Ferreira de la Cerda concluded his account with the following confession, quote, "The doubt that had accompanied me on my arrival to interview the children was the same that was with me when I took my leave of the three. Did they really see an image?" Unquote. The priest prudently opted to, quote, await the decision of Rome, unquote. Father Lacerda capitalized the term image in his account when he asked, did they really see an image? In the published account, and this is noteworthy because it draws our attention to the inherent ambivalence of that term, that is, the degree to which it is entangled with experience, history, lore, and visual traditions. We continue to learn something. Image might denote a picture, a mental figure, or a misty, luminous formation in the air, or even only in the eyes and shared fantasy of the children. What did they see, as a question, is no less apt, since image could denote everything from a hallucination to a mirage, a specter, or an imaginatively gestalted form or motif. Likewise, A visionary apparition is difficult to pin down. In what sense is it there? Yet Father Lacerda was not bothered by the ontology of the image. He accepted the possibility of Our Lady appearing to the children. After all, she had a history of doing that. What concerned him was the veracity of the children's claim, and no doubt the anxiety of taking a position on the matter without the authoritative support of church hierarchy. Stability, after all, was the most important concern in view of the menace to Christianity posed by the contemporary revolution in Russia and the political state of Portugal, where the secular forces of the new republic violently challenged the church and its alliance with the monarchy. Seeing an image of Our Lady would only be acceptable if the church ruled it was. Father Lacerda's question is apt for another reason. The children themselves in their interviews repeatedly referred to the Lady in imagistic terms, that is, as an image in the sense of a picture. They compared her appearance to pictures, to holy card images, and to statues. That Father Lacerda was looking for the image that the children might have seen is suggested by his observation that the youngest member of the group, Jacinta, knew only her own church and a chapel nearby, which he presumed served as the basis for her visual knowledge. But according to Lacerda, Jacinta told him in 1917, later on, that, quote, none of the statues there are like the lady that we saw, unquote. The effulgent figure of the visions in 1917, first referred to only as, quote, the lady, gripped the three children in speechless amazement. Having arrived in a flash of light from the beyond, they said, the figure told them to pray, particularly the rosary, to offer reparations for offenses to God, and that the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary expect them to suffer. But this would lead to, she said, the conversion of sinners. This was the primary message of what the children quickly made public. This message content is paired with a remarkably static visual impression. On every occasion of her appearance, according to the children, what began as a luminous spectacle transformed into spoken words and the virtually motionless form of statuary. She moved very little, and she was a small, about a meter high, they said, figure that was quite still. She only moved her hands occasionally when she spoke. She hovers above the oak shrub on a cloud, moving only her hands in rhetorically deliberate gestures of blessing. Throughout the period of the apparitions, it seems clear the children were thinking of devotional statuary to anchor the fleeting sensation of what they saw. Again and again, they make allusions to that kind of visuality as they discuss what they saw. Rather than a discrete event, revelation, I want to suggest, may be said to unfold over time as an engagement of sensation, memory, lore, and supporting visual media. In other words, the ontology of visions is manifold. The blurry, suggestive, but indefinite impressions of photographs or optical effects of video like these prompt the viewer to resolve the visual field, to complete by a variety of means what is missing. This means that a vision per se is only part of what people wind up seeing. The final result, if it is ever final, will consist in various proportions of perception, of imagination, of historical tradition, theological discourse, narrative, folklore, imagery, and perhaps inevitably error, exaggeration, hallucination, or even fabrication. All sifted through the medium of memory, the role of need and the role of desire, both for the girls and the girl Lucia as a girl and as her adult self. She went on to spend the rest of her life reflecting on this and writing successive memoirs about what she saw. and of course for the community of belief that gathered around the children immediately and never stopped being an active agency within this ongoing process of revelation. The occasion of the first apparition of Our Lady on May 13, 1917, began when the children saw, quote, what seemed to be a flash of lightning, unquote. They turned and began to descend the slope with their sheep. As they walked, they saw more lightning, and a few steps later, quote, we saw ahead of us, over a scrub oak, a lady dressed all in white, more brilliant than the sun dispensing light, clearer and more intense than a crystal cup full of crystalline water penetrated by the rays of the most glaring sun. We stopped, surprised by the apparition. We were so close that we stood within the radiance which surrounded her and reached a distance of perhaps 5 feet, unquote. As you might imagine, that's not a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old girl talking. It's the adult Lucia remembering what they saw and recasting it in a much more sophisticated and subtle language. And we'll see that as she grew older, she became very reflective and I think very visually sophisticated about trying to recapture the sense, the phenomenology of visions and of the scintillating light effects. As noted earlier, the children were not sure who the figure was when she first appeared as they told the story in 1917. But the faithful public had affixed the Virgin's identity to the apparition long before then with the help of holy cards, tracts, and word of mouth, resolving all ambivalence to suit themselves, especially in what became the official portrayal of the apparition in the statue that I've already shown you. Which migrated in to many other visual representations. As you can see here, that's the 1920 version that ended up in tract and a prayer card here, and this is a 1947 version by the same artist, responding in part to criticisms from Lucia that ended up finding its way into all kinds of other visual media. We can discern some important patterns in the mechanics of visionary experience at work during the final apparition in October of 1917. Although Lucia briefly described to a priest what she saw that evening, the conditions vary, but are analogous in effect. We hear about brief solar brilliance, radiant bodies, luminous effects such as transparency and flashes of light, and the mercurial shape-shifting clouds. In view of this dynamic visual medium, I want to turn to the other function of images that I mentioned at the outset, suggestion. The power of suggestion, evident in the diagnostic use of Rorschach blots, seems at work in the children's response to the visual spectacle of flashing lights, thunder, clouds, and solar effects. The children were not without some useful pictorial resources that helped them come to terms with their experience, even in 1917. It is important to realize that devotional imagery had been part of the devotional lives of the children from their earliest years. Their parents were quite devout, and the children were very much engaged in a variety of devotional practices. Indeed, we can discern its operation in their imaginations, forming, correcting, and transforming mental images and memories into objects that correspond to events in physical imagery. When Lucia was asked on the evening of October 13th, 1917, the day the lady appeared for the last time, she was asked if she saw, because she had said she did, St. Joseph and the Holy Child, as had been promised by the lady in the apparition of August 18th. Lucia confirmed that she had, and said that also, quote, our Lord appeared and blessed the people and Our Lady of the Two Cards, unquote. That's what she referred to it as. When asked what the two cards meant, Lucia replied that one of the figures appeared to be Our Lady of Carmel, whose image in devotional art has long held the scapular in one hand and the Christ child in the other, who himself holds a scapular, as this 19th century Portuguese holy card shows. In interviews given on the evening of that day, Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco all were separately interviewed about the appearance of the figures in the clouds and the light after Our Lady departed. Each of the children confirmed that the figures appeared very near the sun. Whether scintillating effects of the sunlight or moving clouds, the images appear to have been incomplete and evanescent. The figures were more suggestions than definite form. Asked how she knew the figure was Our Lady of Carmel, Lucia replied that, quote, she, the figure, had some things hanging from her hand, unquote, which she presumed were scapulars. When she was asked if she saw Jesus, Lucia replied, quote, I saw the figure of a man. I think it was our Lord, unquote. Where was the figure? She said it was near the sun. The clouds and dazzling effects of sunlight morphed into a series of formations in which the children recognized several pictorial paradigms of devotional iconography, showing you 3 of them here. An existing stock of pictures helped them render from the evanescence something which they could affirm as sacred imagery. The 2 cards that Lucia mentioned were no doubt references to common iconography pictured on holy cards, the probable source of the children's recognition of visual patterns composing the holy figures in the sky. Such images were common to them and often figured in their own devotional experience. A physician who became close to the seriously ill Jacinta during the final year of her life, 1920, took the opportunity to speak with her on several occasions and wrote after her death that she, quote, liked to look at holy pictures, one among them in particular of Our Lady of Sameru, which you see here, which she said most closely resembled the Lady of the Apparitions. The image was of a statue of Mary located in the sanctuary of Our Lady of Sameru, a 19th century Marian shrine in Braga, Portugal, about 250 kilometers north of Fatima. Pious images, Jacinta never went to Braga. She would have relied on reproductions that circulated of the image. Pious images such as statuary, lithographs, engravings, and photographs served in this respect as models for the children's response to and interpretation of things like cloud formations and the suggestion of figures, patterns that they were able to recognize precisely because their visual memories were stocked with devotional imagery. Generally speaking, the children's accounts suggest greater reliance on sacred images to make sense of what they saw, and the adult Lucia's recollections feature more detailed descriptions of luminous and cloudy optical effects. As an adult, looking back on the experience, Lucia was also more candid about the indefinite, radiant quality of what appeared before her. What she remembered was not the solid, conventional forms shown in the paradigmatic form and iconography of the 1920 image of Our Lady that I showed you, but something much more minimal and suggestive. As pointed out already, she did not know who the figure was at first, and she wrote later in 1937 in one of her memoirs, quote, I began to doubt if the manifestations were from the devil who by these means was trying to make me lose my soul, unquote. But even after Our Lady revealed her identity, ambivalence of a kind would remain in the visual data of Lucia's memories. We learned something important about the phenomenology of apparitions and their relation to devotional imagery from a conversation that Lucia had with a sculptor. A Dominican priest, an American priest named Thomas McGlynn, who was also an artist, traveled to Portugal in 1946 to show Lucia his model for a sculpture of Our Lady of Fatima. This is the model he took with him, small clay model. To his dismay, Lucia found the clay figure wanting. She objected to the smooth texture of its garment. The light, she told McGlynn, was waves and gave, I'm quoting her here, waves and gave the impression of a garment with folds. It gave the impression of a garment with folds. She went on to say, quote, she was surrounded by light and she was in the middle of light, unquote. Moreover, Lucia said that the figure's tunic and mantle or long veil were incorrect in McGlynn's model. When Father McGlynn asked about their visual differentiation, something he wanted to achieve in clear sculptural terms, in massing, in his design of the figure, Lucia pointed out, quote, the mantle was not a solid object. She said it was a wave of light, and the tunic was another wave of light, interacting with the first. They were two waves of light, she said, one on top of the other. When McGlynn asked about the golden line on the mantle, which had been portrayed by Tejim's two versions, lost my place here. Lucia said it was like, quote, a ray of sunlight all around the mantle. When the sculptor insisted on a simple distinction of the two forms in the material language of sculptural form, the reply from Lucia was remarkable. She said, quote, no matter what you do, you won't give the impression of the reality, unquote. The tangible form and medium of a sculpture were inherently incommensurate with the optical pyrotechnics of the vision, as she came to remember it later in her life. But the sculptor persisted. Dedicated to promoting, he was passionately dedicated to promoting the devotion to Fatima in the US. So he came to the source to walk away with an authentic sculpture that he had actually been commissioned by an American producer of mass producer of Catholic statuary to secure, because the company was gambling that this devotion was going to take off. It was a good gamble because it certainly did. In part because she was disappointed with the inaccuracies of Tejim's statue of Fatima. This is the earlier one. Sister Lucia agreed to consult with McGlynn to reconceive his idea, the one she had criticized, and to try to bring it closer to her impressions. She posed with the resulting model, as you can see here. The result pleased the Bishop of Fatima enough that he encouraged McGlynn to find a patron to enable a large version to be carved from marble for the facade of the basilica at Fatima, which McGlynn was able to complete in 1958 and see installed there in the following year, which you see here. The final version includes features that blur the difference between the welter of the original experience and what the entire cultus came to mean. So even as Sister Lucia was struggling to recapture this evanescent quality, the pressure to produce a clear message for this devotion, which was going global now with the support of the Vatican in the context of the Cold War, the formation of the Blue Army in the United States to fight the Red Army, and through the devotion to Fatima. All of these pressures came to bear on the final production of this sculpture, which then was tasked with clearly conveying the message. So there was a refocus on its theological content in light of its launching global career. The heart, for instance, is a theological interpolation, the heart that we see on Mary. And the cloud on which the figure stands is an accommodation to a widely transmitted lore. Lucia herself told the sculptor that she never saw a cloud. There was no cloud in the vision. The other children reported the cloud, and the response to that quickly took root. It's already there in the 1920 image and had become so fixed that most images of Fatima today still include the cloud. It seems clear from the evidence that of her remarks that what Lucia remembers seeing was dazzling luminosity that suggested color and form without literally constituting it. What she saw may have been rather similar to what happens in the brain during neurological firing. Cognition does not occur in terms of dense, fully executed and detailed forms, because that would require too much attention, too much buffer space. Mental processing of immediate events requires much greater velocity in order to keep pace with events as they occur in real time. In these moments, the human brain operates in the schematic, minimalistic terms of what cognitive scientists call probabilistic reasoning. Working with little information, cognition treats it as a hypothesis to be constantly tested and retested against fresh sensations. Rather than laboriously constructing elaborate mental copies of objects we perceive, moment-to-moment perception consists of the brain quickly assembling a few points of data that it repeatedly, progressively compares to what it sees or hears. Perception is a swift matching process of minimal information that confirms or falsifies the match. I would like to suggest that this bare configuration or schema is what an image first is in a neurological sense at a primary level of cognition. The schema is what we perceive as we scan a crowd, for example, a field of activity, or an event unfolding before us. It is approximate, imprecise, and sketchy. The more elaborated picture is what we look to in order to interpret the schema in a matching process that ends by merging the two. As we focus on an object, our mental image of it, or a picture of it, our cognition changes in character from impression to stored memory, in which we call up a static image that requires more time, focus, and mental energy to sustain. But to get there, we need the schema, the original sensation. Thought is a process of moving from the evanescent schema to the fixed image and back again in a reverberating dialectic of confirmation. The schema itself is always incomplete and in need of elaboration. And the static image, for its part, is always in need of emotional infusion and narrative animation. Whereas the schema is incomplete but vivacious, the iconic and paradigmatic image is completed but never identical with the reality that the schema promised, which is what I think the older Lucia was trying to reanimate, trying to capture again in her lucid descriptions of what she'd seen so many years before. This may be applied to devotional visual piety with rather little difficulty. The devotee's restless looking comes to rest in the stable, enduring cult image. We see in Lucia's dialogue with Father McGlynn the very process I am describing. His elaborate image failed to match her schematic memories, which in themselves failed to congeal into the cult image that might evoke the tangibility of the original event that she longed for. Visions or apparitions like what the children saw at Fatima need the stability that visual motifs can provide in order to resolve the inherent ambivalence of an ineffable experience. For Lucia, attention vibrated between schema and paradigm in an endless process of corroboration and revivication. And McGlynn's sculpture most successfully anchored the schema to a concrete representation. Tejim's figures concretize for viewers what they are prepared to believe the children actually saw. The randomness and the unprecedentedness of the strangeness, you might say, of the actual apparition is replaced by the solidity of purpose or message, which caters to the supplication and devotional access. The generative entanglement of imagery in perception, in memory, fantasy, and picture is what makes a visionary event into an accessible devotional artifact. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting. I wanted to ask you if you could expand a little on the relationship between image and text. And you spoke, I thought, very interestingly about Lucia's own memories, but I was wondering more about ephemeral texts like newspaper reports and the relationship between those kind of textual materials and the visual imagery you've been discussing.
Sure. They played a very important role. The businessman who in 1920 wanted to promote the devotion and paid and commissioned the sculpture, had seen some of these, had read a tract or a pamphlet produced by a priest who had interviewed the children. There were multiple sources of the description in circulation, some quoted in newspapers, some produced as pamphlets, privately published. The church didn't really get in the act until later, but there was no shortage of ephemeral print circulating. Sometimes these get imbricated on one another, so they quote the earlier stuff and sometimes add to it, change it, merge some of these sources. But when he approached the sculptor, he said, I want you to read these accounts and use them as the basis for what you produce. And he relied in particular on a priest's account that was published in, I think in 1920, the same year he was creating the sculpture, who had interviewed the children successively by himself and also in the presence of other priests during and then immediately after the apparitional period. So that was the source that the sculptor, when he was asked, how do you know this is what the kids saw, he would refer to that. And Lucia then later took issue with that, saying, no, actually, there's a lot of inaccurate stuff. And she accused the artist of taking liberties. Father McGlynn, the American priest, when he was there, looked up the artist, who was still alive, and was engaged in producing a second version, 46 and 47. He actually did 2 more versions. He told Father McGlynn, yeah, okay, it's not exactly what I read, but an artist has to have, an artist has his right. He has his own imagination that plays an important role in creating an image that works visually. So there were a variety of variations in the source material, but also in the artist's own conception.
Could I just actually take MC's privilege and maybe asking a follow-on question, because I was thinking along similar lines to Lizzie there. One of the things that struck me when you were talking about, for instance, the holy cards and how they might have suggested images, I was thinking, for instance, more of the fairly elaborate description of hell with this vision of hell that was recorded from
a lot of Jesuit.
July 1917, but which was, I think, one of these so-called 3 secrets, you see, which wasn't revealed at the time, but was revealed much later on. And I just wonder, again, Lucia would have been much, much older at that stage, and that very elaborate description is being informed by obviously many, not just things she's seen, but obviously religious texts and preaching, one would suspect, and so on. Yeah,
it's interesting. The apocalyptics, the hell, the end of Russia, the new sort of new age coming. This was something that was always more important in the public reception of Fatima than it seems to have been in her mind. In her memoirs, she doesn't dwell on this, written later in life. It's really, that's fascinating to me, is it has to do more with the popular reception of the devotion and this fascinating ongoing set of secrets that became so important, and that a lot of people devoted to Fatima regretted, because it sort of took over in a lot of, particularly as the media responded.
Yes. You can make it to the. What way
Thanks very much for such an interesting lecture. I was just had a question about authority and authenticity. I think it's just very interesting that the children, I suppose they're kind of making this new paradigmatic image from nature. You know, it comes from nature, and the language that she uses about water, light, and tree, and that, you know, that this location of authority gives it a particular kind of authenticity. I just wondered if you could speak to that.
It becomes really clear in her later memoirs that she's leaning on those kinds of tropes and sensibilities much more than in the earliest material, that the interviews with her and the other two that were published. That becomes it's really interesting. They become the triggers, the mnemonic triggers for recapturing a vivacity of this, of keeping this alive. And she went through a kind of crisis in the 30s and early 40s. She was writing these memoirs under order. Her bishop said, we really have to have this. I mean, things were just changing. This was a devotion on wheels. I mean, if you look at the history of Fatima, it's just always being transformed in increasingly large theaters. The church hierarchy gets very involved. Pius XII really seizes this as a critical tool in thinking about the church's role after the end of World War II. The Americans get involved with the Blue Army. These are some really, really devoted characters who want to see that they want to see the church play a major role in the Cold War. So they see this as both the good American thing to do, but also, more importantly for them, the appropriate Catholic thing to do. So it's a devotion that's is far, at that point, far beyond Lucia in a sense. She's this quiet nun in Spain, and I think her monastery was. She was in a Dorothean monastery, I think, in Spain, very near the Portuguese border. Yeah, it's in Tui, right? It's a fascinating thing to study because you're constantly comparing the magnitude of these settings and the scale. But what I find really interesting, the point you're making, is her crisis, her spiritual crisis, wondering, did I get this right? Is Satan using this to threaten me? And she really goes through a kind of crisis in which she actually wonders in a few letters to the bishop, you know, I'm really unsure about this. So part of her way of dealing with that kind of menace is to focus on these very tangible modes of sensation, you know, the concrete. They're evanescent, they're fleeting, but they're also sensory, very, very sensory, you know, light, and she talks about snow, she talks about crystal, she talks about light moving through vessels of water, uses a variety of rich metaphors to capture what it was that she remembered seeing.
Yes, Jacinta?
My name is Jacinta Lucy. Glad to say that. And I'm here from the History Department. Honouring Monsignor Corish, who was our head of the department for many years. But just a little tiny thing to maybe just a thought for going away, because I know we've people here from the seminary as well. I was in Fatima for the devotion, for the canonization of Jacinta and Francisco. I was there with my father. I can't claim to have had any kind of devotion or anything special, but I was given that name. But on the occasion of the canonization, the bishops of Fatima issued a pastoral letter. And I was there in the church that day when bits of it were read in English. I would love to get the hold of it. But it was on the honouring the spiritual life of children. And that children have a deep, rich spiritual life in their own right. And the whole occasion was taken for the call to the church in Fatima for the catechizing of children. Yeah. And I thought it was absolutely beautiful and just absolutely spot on. The bit I remember was they talked about how we had recognised virtuosity, say, in Mozart. We've no problem with a child prodigy, and we have virtuosity in so many fields. You can also have virtuosity in the spiritual life, and these children, appear to have been in that realm, and the best kind of response to this big national occasion and all that was cherishing the spiritual life of children and taking it seriously.
It's actually an important part of the reception of the statues too. It was on Youth Day, I think it was 1942, if I'm not mistaken, that the 1920 image was taken on procession from Fatima to Lisbon. And the response was pulled on a wagon, I think, all that way, to celebrate Youth Day, to go to Lisbon to celebrate Youth Day. The bishop was so impressed by the response to this that he then approached Lucy and said, I think we need more statues. We need a statue. We need the statue at Fatima because millions of pilgrims were coming to see it. We also need a statue that will go mobile, that will travel to the world. And this fabulously successful Youth Day in 42 proved to him that this was a ministry. This needed to be understood in terms of a ministry. So indeed, they commissioned not only one, but two more identical images. One that would travel around Portugal and one that went to live in Muncie, Indiana, which is called the International Virgin Pilgrim, I think. And she goes everywhere. She's still a globe-trotting. She inverts pilgrimage. She goes to the pilgrims rather than the pilgrims come to her. And I had the occasion to go there and interview the caretaker a few years ago, and he buys a plane ticket for the statue and one for himself, and that's a fascinating history. And the ministry was dedicated to getting her inside Russia in order to fulfill the one of the secrets of the vision. Not a secret, because that one was revealed early on, and eventually they did get her to Russia.
Just a small question. Thank you for your talk. Francisco, is there anything on record about his perceptions at the time?
He was interviewed at the same time as the other two. He said that he could not hear or see her. Or he couldn't hear her. He couldn't talk to her. Lucy was the only one who talked directly with Our Lady. Jacinta could see her and hear everything, but Francisco could only see. He couldn't hear what she was saying and engage. So they had different levels of response, but he did describe what he saw in a series of interviews, and
And thanks again for such a wonderful presentation. Having had the opportunity as a seminarian to study philosophy and to look at beauty and art a little bit, I began to kind of have this little kind of problem with religious art and with prayer cards and the like. And I suppose I was wondering if, because you discussed different prayer and religious cards and how they're used, and how, I guess, for someone perhaps like me who's studying and has the opportunity to go into thinking more about art and just religious imagery and these connections, can you say anything to that kind of maybe temptation to be very negative about these I don't know how many, the millions of prayer cards that are produced, and sometimes you get another prayer card, you're like, oh gosh, thank you.
Save them, because one day they'll be collected.
If you could just say anything to that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I that's part of my own story. Salvador referred to it. I was a farm kid, first in my family to go to college. I was, and you go through this, at least I did, through this phase where you feel like you've got a lot of making up to do. You've got to cover a lot of ground that you look around at your peers who grew up in New York or Paris or wherever, and they're miles ahead. So you feel like you've got to be more Catholic than the Pope. You've got to be really, really, really aesthetically minded and artistically sophisticated and develop a taste that is better than, and that's the way I was educated. But what was sort of like, you know, the scales that fell from my eyes, it occurred in, I don't know, sometime around when I was finishing up, I read a really interesting book by an art historian, and it's called The Power of Images. And it's a fascinating book, and I recommend you might take a look at this book. His name is David Friedberg. And he said, you know, it's really interesting. If you look at what art historians do, they're interested in some images, and they're not interested in all kinds of others. They're very interested in humanist, Renaissance humanism. They're very interested in Baroque fine art. But they don't look at fetishes. They don't look at obscene things. They don't look at pornography. They don't look at kitsch. They don't look, and he named all the kinds of stuff that's beyond the pale. And he said, why is it we've designed a discipline, speaking as an art historian, that has these deep prejudices? What cultural work do those biases do? And that was, for me, a wake-up call. I thought, yeah, wow, those are questions I never asked myself. And it happened to correspond with the experience that Salvador referred to when I went to this conference to talk about art and religion. I figured, well, we'll be talking about Michelangelo and Bach and blah, blah, blah. Well, during that, the curator of the museum said to me, he said, you know, we've got the portrait of Jesus here. I said, oh, really? You've got the portrait? What is that, you know? And he showed me. He went over and pulled out the original head of Christ. Too bad I don't have it with me. I'm sure you've seen it a lot. It's used by Catholics and Protestants and Mormons. It's this very, you know, this sort of brownish image of Jesus who's looking from this three-quarters view. You see him looking up. And he said, we've got the original one here. And I said, like you said, I didn't know there was an original. I thought it was just, you know, Baudrillard's concept of the simulacrum, the image with no original. It's just out there on the billions. Well, there it was. And there was an art historian, a senior art historian there at this conference, and he launched into a really vituperous attack on this image, saying, oh, this is kitsch. This is, his phrase was, he was an Episcopalian fellow. He said, this is bad art for bad faith. That was his critique. And I thought, well, you know, you can say that. I understand coming from a certain perspective why that would hold. On the other hand, what do you miss if you take that perspective? You miss the world of popular piety that is built and maintained by a different kind of imagery and a different range of visual practices. And if the point, and I guess this is really the issue, if the point is to understand how people build their worlds and keep them in working order, then we need to look at the stuff they use, the tools they use. Not with the idea of praising it as great, as overlooked great art. It isn't. But to see what role images play in making their worlds coherent. And without lionizing them, those images. And that really freed me up to think. I'm still interested in fine art. I still write about fine art. I still love to go to museums unapologetically about that. It's great. But, you know, the world is bigger than just that, I think.
Could I just offer one very brief comment on the ineffability problem here, which is, there's a lovely church in East Anglia which has a kind of a very cheap guide to the images, the medieval images on the walls, and it has one wonderful image which it describes as a life-size representation of God.
That's great. That's delightful.
The thing I've noticed then from the west of Ireland, we have Knock, is pretty much the Irish version of Fatima. And the images, the older images that we have are very much, there's a white lady and she's very much, not a whole lot of detail in it. And in the last 4 or 5 years, we've started to have these new images which are very much brown hair and blue eyes and kind of a nice cream cloak or whatever. And I'm just wondering what you might say about that, or is there, what's going on there? Is it because we're getting so far away from it that it's easier to be a bit more creative, or what?
Yeah, I mean, devotions have a life, and sometimes imagery's currency runs out and it has to be renewed. It would be, I don't know, I mean, I know the apparition of Knock. I don't know the imagery well. I don't know. It would be. I mean, that would be a great point of entry in the inquiry. Why this shift? What's going on racially, ethnically? What's going on in terms of the commercial supply of imagery? Are there new players in promoting the devotion? If so, what is their agenda? It just sort of triggers a number of fascinating questions that make it an interesting research project.
I really enjoyed your paper. Something that really stood out for me was the idea of stabilizing the cult of Marian apparitions, and I wondered if you ever thought about Marian apparitions that weren't so successful.
Yeah.
Perhaps why?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking particularly of Our Lady of the Windy Gap in County Down. From my homestead, so maybe something really.
Wow, that's really that's a great question, great topic. I'm struck by as radical. I mean, you come to the topic of Marian apparitions as a scholar, and it seems radical. I mean, the Almighty comes down, and that's we get used to the idea of incarnation, but it's still it has a frisson to it. It's still an interesting event. You want to try to figure out how does the culture respond? How do you study this as a scholar? What does this mean? But as radical as they are, they're also extremely conservative. The role of recycling iconography is really interesting. We saw you could see it here, stabilizing. It's a kind of anchoring effect. You want change, but you don't want too much change, or you got to make change that still allows recognition. Sometimes the Marian apparitions, I'm thinking one in Amsterdam, a famous one in the mid-20th century. It's so radical that people don't recognize it. They don't see Our Lady in it. Artists invent new iconography. There are twists in the narratives that don't fit the patterns, and this is one of the things the church looks for. Does it fit our expectations of the Virgin, who she is, and how she behaves? And novelty is it's interesting balance. You need some novelty to make it to get your attention, but you don't need too much, because the more novelty, the less recognition, the less stability. And the church is always, not just the institutional church, but church people want affirmation, stability, a place within the community that can anchor their experiences and help them deal with problems. And that means there's a kind of a pastoral conservatism in the adoption of iconography. And you can see, if you line up Lourdes, for instance, and Fatima and others, it does look like that's Our Lady. You see it. But some of these, as I was saying, there's one, I can't remember the name of this one in Amsterdam. Our Lady of All Nations, yeah. A friend of mine is working on that, and he was showing me some of the imagery and some of the transcripts, and it's kind of weird. It's which makes it interesting, of course, but it's some bishops are for it, some are against. It's a more controversial situation. Medjugorje, for instance, didn't make the grade, and there are actually lots of these, many in the U.S. A lot of Catholic communities in the Midwest in Wisconsin, for instance, have experienced these, in New York, elsewhere. So I'm always interested in the visual dynamics of making this work, or actually making it not work.
Time for one or two more questions, yes?
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. I'm coming from a very different perspective, but you've given me so much food for thought. I work in 8th century Irish mythology, and at the moment I'm working on metamorphosis. And given your last comment there in answer to my friend from Windy Gap, that the important thing in the metamorphosis is that the change always comes with recognition.
Yeah.
And again, that's stability, and at the same time something new. And I just want to say thank you. I came especially to hear you, and I'm so glad that I did. Thank you very much.
It's always embarrassing in the presence of fellow students like myself and very eminent theologians and historians to ask a question that might seem strange and risk your reputation. One thing I found very interesting, Professor Morgan, was the image of the three, your photograph of the three young children. Would you mind going back to that image? Mm-hmm. And my simple, single observation is...
That was at the beginning, right?
Yes. My simple, single observation is the pose. Each of them is holding their hands in a different way. Mm-hmm. And my question to you is perhaps very tangential, but I would like to hear your observations generally in that photograph, please.
It's fascinating. Roland Barthes, the great French semiologist, had a concept he explored in a book called Camera Lucida. He said every photograph has something he called the punctum, this thing that reaches out and pricks you, pokes you, punches you to get your attention. And it becomes, I found that concept interesting because then it becomes a kind of embodied relationship based on pain between the viewer and the image. And I think you're right. If I had to locate the punctum in this image, it would be these three sets of hands because they say something about those individuals the more you study them. Jacinta was quite a character. She was a kind of a child genius and could not stop talking. She had lots of ideas. She was a morally severe person. She was the one I would imagine would have gone into religious life, but she died very early. And that hand on the hip, to me, just speaks volumes about personality and presence. She's an interesting character. I enjoy reading her. There's been a fair amount written about her. Well, she's, went on to be beatified, but even long before then, there's a good deal of literature. Francisco also died early. The two kids died early. He was the least by far articulate among them. So his hands to me talk about action. He was the young shepherd. He was the fellow who was about action and movement. And Lucy is the most interesting one because we know so much about her as she grew into adulthood. And her hands there are quite fascinating because she had real problems with her mother. Her mother, for a long time, refused to believe this and called her to her face a liar and beat her and just was terribly embarrassed by the whole thing. She resisted it. And so Lucy had told the children, we're going to entertain ourselves. They were alone. And they had a variety of games, and she was the game master. And I say that because some historians have interpreted the whole thing as an elaborate game that Lucia launched. I just think that's too simplistic. It's too reductionist as an explanation. I find it interesting the way her hands are like this because after the first apparition, when they were going back home, she said, and she made the two agree, we will not say a word about this. This is our secret. We will not share this with anybody. So to me, those hands suggest a kind of keeping things close to the chest. So it's impossible for me not to look at those hands and see them speak to the personalities of those three children.
So it just remains for me to first of all thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. As Professor Malani, our president, said at the start, these are strange times. And so it does take something for people to come out. And I think it's testament to just the interest that there was in the topic, and also the regard that people have for your work, David, and people who have travelled some a great distance to be here to hear you this evening, and that's very heartening. And we're very, very grateful to you for travelling over and delivering what has been a scintillating lecture. Thank you all very much.